Well, good morning. Welcome to New Life. Thanks so much for choosing to spend part of your Sunday morning with us. We are incredibly grateful for the opportunity to be here together with you, that you carved out some time and some space in your lives. I feel like we came in today. Like, I don't know what happened, but it's like you were all very chatty today, and now it's like, anyway. People are not sitting where they normally sit, and it's throwing me off. I'm just gonna say it. It just throws me off. It's all right. You're good, Ken. You're good. See, right? Like it's not just me, right? Like I'm a creature of habit. I don't know if you know this about me, but I like when things stay where they're supposed to stay and people stay where they're supposed to stay and things don't get messed around. Like that's good for me. Anyway, you guys feel free. I don't do this anymore, but I used to, and again, I don't know what happened to me, but there used to be Sundays when you would come into church and I would just change the chairs around just to mess with people, just because I don't do that anymore. But I may do it just to mess with myself at this point. We are in the middle of the very long series of messages called The Jesus Project. The Jesus Project is, just a reminder, recap, our best attempt over a 3-year period to see everything that Jesus said and everything that Jesus did, to cover all of it without skipping anything, without missing stuff, trying to fit it into, as best as we could, a sort of chronological framework. And I've told you from the beginning that it's really hard to do because the gospel writers, they tell 4 different stories about Jesus' life. It's essentially the same story, but told from 4 different perspectives. And sometimes when they put their pieces together, they put them together in different spots. And it makes it hard for someone like me who likes order and likes structure and likes things to not be chaotic to figure out, where do we put these stories? And so I'm just going to tell you, for the next few weeks, we're going to be in John's gospel. And I didn't really know where to put these stories. I don't really know how they fit inside of the structure that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are telling, which is very kind of detailed and timeline-oriented. And John, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, John is like the problem child of the gospel writers because he tells very different stories, and he tells them in ways that don't seem, at least to me, to make sense. Like, when is this supposed to fit inside of the Jesus story as we know it? And so we're going to be trying to make some sense of these stories that are a little bit maybe out of order, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure exactly where they go in the Gospels. We're going to do them here. So we can all agree on that's what we're going to do. One of our cultural values, and this is maybe something that goes back to sort of our sort of revolutionary roots, our Enlightenment roots as a group of people, is, and maybe that's something that's taken increasing prominence and kind of increasing importance in culture and in our world as I've gotten a little bit older, is this value of open-mindedness. Right, so it's incredibly important that we culturally be known as open-minded people. This is one of the things that if you sort of, kind of talk to your friends and family members and you were to say, well, if someone's a closed-minded person, we have some really strong opinions about what it means to be closed-minded, and we generally don't like them. What it means for us and sort of what it has translated over into is that, they're sort of intolerant people, or they might be bigoted people, or they might be hateful people. We sort of have equated this idea of being closed-minded about things with something that is not necessarily a good thing. And we like open-mindedness, and I'm not here to decry open-mindedness and say we shouldn't be open-minded, because on the good side, being open-minded means that you're always asking questions, right? Like, if you are genuinely an open-minded person, you are always asking questions. You're always asking, what's the next why? And if you've ever been in a conversation with a person like that, it can get really annoying, can't it? Right? Like, if you've had children, you've been in a conversation with people like that, because they love to ask that question, right? Why? And then you tell them an answer, and then they tell you why. And eventually you get to the answer that I, as a parent, said I would never say when I was a kid, right? Right? Like, because your parents said it, and you all know what the answer is. It's when you get to a certain point, it's just because I said so. Because that's the way it has to be. And at a certain point, all of us get really closed-minded, don't we? Right? Like, at a certain point, it's like enough questions, we just have to, kind of make a decision, go on. But we recognize, right? Like, there's something good about being open-minded. It creates this opportunity for us to ask questions. In a lot of ways, that's what we're trying to do with this Jesus Project series, is really ask a lot of questions, think through some things that maybe we have never thought through. But sometimes, and and maybe you found this to be true, sometimes open-mindedness actually covers for a more closed-mindedness underneath it, right? Like sometimes open-mindedness is actually closed-mindedness. Given too much open-mindedness, given too much, hey, let's just question, and let's just ask a bunch of questions. Let's never come to any sort of answers and any sort of conclusions. It actually, underlying that, underneath that, is oftentimes this really closed-mindedness to some things that maybe they just don't want to hear. Maybe you just don't want to deal with. And maybe I just don't want to deal with. In my second year of college, I was at a liberal arts college in Maine. I was going to be a lawyer. Some of you guys know that, but that was sort of my plan and my intent. And between my freshman year and my sophomore year in college, I felt like God had called me into ministry, and I decided to turn from being a lawyer to being a pastor. There's a lot of jokes there. You can leave them alone, but right, so I decided to go from being a lawyer to being a pastor. And I went back to the school that I was at for my second year, and I decided that because I was going to go to Bible school, I should take some Bible courses. Like my college offered these religion courses, and so I decided I was going to take an Old Testament survey class, and I decided I was going to take a New Testament survey class. And then I got the syllabus for and the book list. This was back when you actually had to go to a bookstore and buy books. And I got the syllabus and the book list for my New Testament survey class, and the only textbook on it was a book called The Five Gospels. And I was like, I grew up in church, and I only knew about 4. What's this 5 Gospels? When did we come up with another one? And so I went and I purchased the book, and I looked, because I was just kind of a nerd. And so I was I'm trying to figure out where did we come up with 5 Gospels? How did this, and so what it came down to is there was a group, this was I think in the 80s and early 90s, a group called the Jesus Seminar. And the Jesus Seminar was a group of biblical scholars that got together, and what they did was they decided they were going to vote on all of the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels, and they were going to decide which ones were likely to have been said by Jesus and which ones were not likely to have been said by Jesus. And they basically created this weighted system where they would take words of Jesus as they were recorded in the 4 Gospels, and the 5th Gospel was the Gospel of Thomas, and there's a bunch of other Gospels out there, and we'll talk about that at some other point, right? And so they took all of these sayings of Jesus and they would vote on it. And they would sit in a room and they would discuss whether they thought this was likely to have been said by Jesus or not. And then they would give it a value. And if it was in red in my textbook, the Jesus and the 5 Gospels textbook, then they felt like it was very likely to have been said by Jesus. And then it went from pink was a little less likely, and then gray was a little less likely, and then black was no way Jesus said this. And so I read through, and I'm thinking, well, how do they come to these conclusions? This bunch of open-minded biblical scholars that are having these open discussions about, and here's what I realized, if you started to dig underneath the surface of it, they already knew what they thought about Jesus. And then they took the words that are in the Gospels and they decided, how do we take these words that Jesus said and fit them into the narrative that we've already decided we believe about Jesus? We don't believe that Jesus could say things like this because we don't believe Jesus was sent from God in any sort of meaningful way. And so if there's anything in here that looks remotely like Jesus has any sort of awareness of the world around him that comes from anything other than just his humanness, then we're going to put that in black. And what I found was that almost the entire Gospel of John was in black. They were like, now, John just made all this stuff up. He just came up with some really good ideas, and he threw it into a page that fit, sort of his narrative. And so it was interesting to me because this group that was, sort of had kind of prided itself on being open-minded was actually really kind of closed-minded about their impressions of and their discussions about Jesus. It was supposed to be this project that was dedicated to the pursuit of a historical understanding of Jesus, except it felt like they had already decided their historical understanding of Jesus. And then rather than being open-minded and asking real, genuine questions, they got real closed-minded. And it seemed like, to me, I was just a sophomore in college, a 19-year-old kid, it seemed kind of silly to shut off questions just because you had already decided what you thought and what you believed. And then you realize, right, that so much of Jesus' experience inside of the Gospels is exactly that. Is people who have already decided what they believed about him, and then they continued sort of digging their heels into the things that they already thought that they knew, and rather than being genuinely open to the things that Jesus was saying and the things that Jesus was doing, they just closed themselves down. And so our entire goal in this series has been to try to be as open-minded as we possibly can, ask a bunch of questions, figure out what we need to figure out about who Jesus is, and instead of digging our heels in and saying, well, this is what I've always understood about Jesus, to ask ourselves if maybe we could see something in a different way, from a different angle and a different perspective than we've seen it before. And the passage that we're going to be in this morning in John, I think, is somewhat about this idea of, can you open your eyes? Can you open your heart? Can you open your understanding to actually seeing Jesus in a different way? Or are you just going to close yourself down and say, this is what I've always thought, this is what I've always believed, and I'm just sticking to it because I don't want to deal with the pesky questions about him. Here's where it starts in John chapter 9, verse 1. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And this conversation and this incident in Jesus' life takes place, we believe, somewhere inside of Jerusalem. Now, again, I've been telling you all along that Jesus is traveling up to Jerusalem and hasn't gotten to Jerusalem yet. So how does he get inside of Jerusalem? I don't know. Right? Like, I think it's possible that we should believe that maybe Jesus did go into Jerusalem before he publicly entered on the colt of the donkey that he rode in on Palm Sunday. It's entirely possible that Jesus spends some time inside of the city dealing with people inside of there before he goes through the whole public procession. That's entirely possible. I don't know. It doesn't make sense on the timeline. I'm just going to tell you that. So if you're really holding me to the timeline, don't. Because I did my best, but I'm not perfect with this. But what happens inside of Jerusalem is Jesus walks by a man who's born blind from his birth, and it creates this conversation between Jesus and his disciples where the disciples say something that seems fitting and seems like a way that they understood the way that God worked. And they looked at a person who had been born blind, and they assumed that someone somewhere inside of this man's family had done something wrong, and because they had sinned, because something had gone wrong somewhere, this man was suffering his blindness as a result of someone else's sin and disobedience to God. And again, this is something that Jesus has already said on multiple occasions. This isn't the way that it works. But here, this is probably the clearest moment in which we get this kind of theology and this kind of understanding about God expressed, even from the disciples. Who sinned so that this man would be born blind? And Jesus says, it's not that anybody sinned. The reason that this is happening and the reason that I'm here in this moment is so that the works that belong to God could be displayed in his life, so that I could do something here in this moment for this man who's been born blind, so that everyone around can see who I am and see who God is at work in his life. Rather than, this is just the result of living in a broken and sinful world, which we all live in, and so we've got stuff that happens inside of our bodies, inside of our lives, and inside of our experience that happens just because there's sin in the world. The disciples think, as did many of their contemporaries, that it was the result of some specific sin. Jesus kind of pushes back on that and says, hey, that's not the way that we want to understand the world. This is one of those moments where you've got to actually open your mind a little bit. Hey, disciples, I don't want you to close in and think that bad things happen only to people who do bad things, right? Because this is the way, and sometimes we still think that, don't we? Bad things happen to people who do bad things. And good things are supposed to happen to people who do good things. Guess what? You know this, right? I know this. That's not the way the world works. Sometimes good things, this is so frustrating, sometimes good things happen to bad people. Does that bother you? It bothers me. I won't put you in the middle of that. But it bothers me when good things happen for bad people. It actually bothers me worse when good things happen for bad people than when bad things happen to good people. Right? Like, I don't know what that says about me. I'm sure there's like somebody can psychoanalyze that at some point or another, right? But like, it bothers me more when good things happen to bad people than when bad things happen to good people. But we recognize, right? This is the way the world works. Bad things sometimes happen to good people. Bad things sometimes happen to people who didn't do anything wrong to cause the bad thing to happen to them. And Jesus says that's the fundamental reality of this world. And yet, in this moment, I'm here so that the works of God could be displayed in this moment. Because while I'm here, and he said this before, I am the light of the world. While I'm here, the years that I get to spend here, my purpose, my job for being here is to show the light to the world, to do the works that my Father sent me to do, and in doing the works that my Father sent me to do, to demonstrate to the world the light and life of my Heavenly Father. And so, having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva, and he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. And so he went and washed and came back seeing. It's just a remarkable moment for this man who's been born blind, has never seen anything in his entire life. And to experience this healing moment from Jesus. To go, now again, you got to think about these things, right? Imagine walking to the pool unable to see, and walking away from the pool, able to see. It's a remarkable transformation that this man experiences. It's the restoration, and this is what we've talked about, it's the restoration of heaven and earth united together that Jesus had showed up to bring about. He'd showed up to bring heaven to earth. And in the experience of this man born blind who walks to the pool of Siloam without being able to see and turns around and goes home being able to see everything that he's never seen and experienced before in his life. Imagine what that feels like. Imagine how much that feels like heaven has come to earth in your own experience. Imagine what it feels like to feel that the works of your Heavenly Father have been done in your life and have so changed and transformed the direction of your life that everything from that moment forward has been different. Jesus says, you are living in the daytime. I'm here to work the works of my Heavenly Father. And part of the works of my Heavenly Father is that the blind would receive sight and the world would receive light. That's why I'm here. The blind people receive sight, and just as much as blind people receive sight, so a world that's been living in darkness, a world that's been living bound up inside of its sinful experience, is going to experience light like it's never experienced before. That's why I'm here. The same one who can open the eyes of the blind can change the entire course and direction of the lives of people who open their eyes to see the light that's shining towards them. The man goes to the pool, blind, walks away seeing, and goes home. And I think, and we've talked about this before in some of the other healing experiences, I think that we are meant to see ourselves inside of this man's experience, right? Because the moment with Jesus is an eye-opening moment. The moment with Jesus is a moment in which we may feel like we have spent our entire lives wandering around in darkness, and then all of a sudden, we can see. All of a sudden, the eyes are opened. All of a sudden, the heart and the soul, everything inside of you that hasn't experienced that life and that light, all of a sudden experiences it. And something changes inside of you. And you go home seeing. And you go home telling a story about what you experienced with a man who found you in blindness and left you seeing. And so, The man goes home, and the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, Is this not the man who used to sit and beg? And some said, It is he. And others said, No, but he is like him. And he kept saying, I am the man. I love that, right? Like, it's me. Like, I know you guys are having these conversations about me. I'm not deaf. I was blind, but I'm not deaf. Like, I can hear everything that you're saying, and you guys are having this conversation. I wonder if it's him. I wonder if, no, it's somebody like him. It's me. Like, I know you guys can't believe this, and I really kind of can't believe it myself, but I'm the person that you knew who was blind and begging by the side of the road. And so they said to them, then how were your eyes opened? How did this happen? How did you come to see what you've never seen before? And he answered, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. And so I went and I washed and I received my sight. And they said to him, where is he? And he said, I don't know. He left. Because, right, like if you have a blind man who's your neighbor and your friend who comes home, and he came home seeing by the hand of a person named Jesus, well, where's this Jesus guy? Because we've got other people that could probably use a moment, right? Like a moment with Jesus. And John records the aftermath of the healing. And we're going to continue it. This is going to be a story in two parts because it's a really long chapter, and so we can't do all of it this week. But he records the aftermath and the conversations that the blind man or the formerly blind man has with his neighbors and with his friends and with other people. And the first layer, the first sort of immediate ripple effect of this man's healing is with those people who have known him personally. And they have a hard time understanding, right? Like you would have a hard time understanding. I would have a hard time understanding. How did this happen to you? Because in the world that they know, in the world that you know and that I know, men who are born blind don't suddenly walk home seeing. Is this the person that we knew, or is there some other sort of explanation that could make sense of a moment like this in which heaven rushes into earth? Because we like to make sense of things, don't we? Like you and I, like this is part of the way that we are designed as human beings. We're always trying to make sense. How does this fit into the world that I know as I know it? And what the man is saying is it doesn't fit into your narrative. You're going to have to open your mind. You're going to have to stop living so closed-minded. You're going to have to open your mind and accept the possibility that something extraordinary could happen inside of this world, that somehow heaven could rush into earth. It's me. Don't talk about me like I'm not here. It's me. This is my life, and this is my experience. And so they brought the man to the Pharisees, the man who had formerly been blind. I don't know why I can't read today. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Ding, ding, ding. Okay, we know this is going to be a problem, right? So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put mud on my eyes and I washed and I see. Simple. Open your minds. This is what happened. And some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Here's my settled opinion about Jesus. This man can't be from God because if he was, he would be keeping the Sabbath, and by healing this man on the Sabbath day, he's not keeping the Sabbath. But others said, on the other side, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? Now you note, right? The first one is a statement, isn't it? And the second one is a question. First one's a statement, second one's a question. First one is a statement. This man is a sinner. We know it for sure. Close the book. Let's just, write the story now. We're not going to ask any more questions. And then others are saying, well, wait a minute. How could a man who is a sinner do the things that this man is doing? And there was a division among them. And so they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him since he has opened your eyes? And he said, he's a prophet. Here's what I think. This is my experience. This is the way that I've kind of made sense of this. And from the immediate ripple of the blind man's friends and neighbors and family members, it all of a sudden starts to ripple out to a second layer, to these Pharisees and religious leaders who are confused by the events. It doesn't make sense inside of their world and are trying to make sense of it. And some of them are trying to make sense of the world and saying, this is the way the world works. People who are sent from God keep the Sabbath. People who are sent from God don't heal blind people on a Sabbath day. They would tell them, come back tomorrow and we'll do it again. Right? Like we've seen this before. Tell them to come back on any of the other 6 days and heal them. People who are sent from God don't violate God's laws and God's principles. It just doesn't work. And so because it just doesn't fit inside of my box about about God, I've decided that this man is over here. He's a sinner. And others are saying, well, let's think about that a little bit more. Let's ask ourselves these questions. If I'm going to put this guy in the box of, he's a sinner, he's outside of the righteous, religious, spiritual person box, then how do we make sense of what we're seeing happen in front of us? Because Jesus' works speak for themselves, right? Like this is the thing that Jesus keeps saying over and over again. The things that I'm doing tell you who I am if you'll pay attention. If you'll open your mind a little bit, you'll ask the questions, and you'll try to interpret the world through the lens of heaven coming to earth. If you can broaden your mind just enough to see that, then what you'll see is that my works speak for themselves. They tell you where I'm from, and they tell you what I'm doing. I'm restoring heaven to earth in this man's life. And you can Sabbath this thing to death. You can parse the words. You can put my actions underneath the microscope. You can do all of those things. And when you do all of those things, you're going to miss the beauty of what's happening inside of this person's life. Because, right, like, can you put yourself in the Pharisees' shoes for a moment, and all you can see is something that doesn't fit, and you lose the experience of a man who had never seen before and now sees. And you, as a Pharisee, you can look at that and say, I don't like this guy. This Jesus healing people on a Sabbath day. Who does that? Right? Like, do you see the difference, right? There's this discussion and there's this debate that happens, and we see it actually inside of John's gospel from time to time. And sometimes we tend to think that all the Pharisees thought and believed the same way, and I don't think that's the case. Right? We saw it early on with Nicodemus, who was one of the Pharisees, came to Jesus at night and said, we need to talk about the works that you're doing, because the works that you're doing indicate to me, they speak for themselves that you've been sent from God, and yet your way of doing it doesn't make sense inside of my way of thinking about God. And so instead of saying, well, then I've decided what I think about you, Nicodemus is willing to have the conversation, ask the questions. What do I think about you? Some think he's a prophet. Others think he's a charlatan and a sinner, and he's leading the people astray. And when they ask the man who was born blind about his experience, he says the only thing that he can think to say, which is he's a prophet. He's been sent to us from God, and we should probably pay attention to him. Because if there's someone here who's opening the eyes of the blind, then we should figure out why he's here. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called his parents, the parents of the man who had received his sight, and asked them, is this your son who you say was born blind? Hear the language, right? How then does he now see? And his parents answered, we know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind, but how he now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Don't ask us. We're not in the middle of this. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "Ask him, he is of age." And we're going to put a period here, but it's really a comma until the rest of the story next week. But that line that we highlighted, right, is the important and significant line in this piece of the story. That some of them had already agreed, this is what we've decided about Jesus. And we've decided that because we believe this about Jesus, we don't want anyone else believing anything else about him. We've decided this is what we think, and therefore this is what you should think. The parents are put in a tough position because they know that if they go along with this, they put themselves in a tough spot with the religious leaders who are going to put them potentially out of their synagogue, out of fellowship with their people. And so they don't want to get in the middle of it. And we'll see next week that the blind man is willing to put himself in the middle of it. We'll kind of get to his part of the story. But again, the Jews had already agreed. And yet what happens, right, is that Jesus unsettles settled conclusions. This is what Jesus does. This is why he bothers you so much sometimes. This is why he bothers me sometimes, right? Jesus unsettles things that we believe, that we've come to a settled conclusion about, and then sometimes we read the stories and we're like, that's not what I thought he would do. That's not what I thought he would say. He does it in a frustrating way, right? Like he does it in a way that tells you, you can't ever stop asking questions. You can't. If you want your faith and your following of Jesus to keep growing, you can't stop asking questions. You can't say, I've settled, I've concluded, I've come to all of my decisions, I've put Jesus in the box. As soon as you put him in the box, he jumps outside of it. This is how he works. This is what frustrated so many people about Jesus, is as soon as you think you've nailed him down, and I've been following Jesus for as long as I can remember, 40-something years, as soon as I think I've got it figured out, I realize I don't. As soon as you think you've got him nailed down, I've come to the settled conclusion. Absolutely, 100%. You'll read something, you'll see something, and you'll experience something, and you'll say, well, there he goes again. Because I don't get it. He can't be the Messiah they believed, because he doesn't fit inside the box. He can't be the one sent from God to rescue and save us, because if he was, he would do things to rescue and save us the way that I think he should. And then Jesus goes and heals blind people on a Sabbath day, restores sight to the blind. He says, I'm going to do things my way, because I'm here to work the works of my Heavenly Father while it's day. And so this morning, I just want to remind us again, and maybe this is like just a good spot for us to put kind of a little pause inside of our Jesus Project series and say, this is our goal, is to pursue an open-minded investigation of Jesus. Just ask questions. Don't stop thinking. Don't check. I've said this before, and I know that some churches that you went to told you the opposite, but I do not want you to check your brain at the door. I don't want you to stop thinking because you came into church on Sunday morning and thought, well, Pastor Keith's going to just tell me what to think about everything. I'm not going to do that. Jesus is not going to do, right? Like, it's interesting, right? Like, if you watch Jesus in conversation with people, that's not what he does. Pursue an open-minded, sincere investigation of Jesus. Let your preconceptions go. Don't decide to box Jesus into the way that you've always thought about him, because as soon as you box him in, and as soon as you think you've nailed it down, here's what happens. You actually become God. You become the person who's telling God what he would or would not do. And that's not a place that you want to be. Are you sincerely in pursuit of an open-minded investigation of Jesus? Are you asking questions? Are you allowing him to unsettle your settled conclusions? Are you allowing him to mess with you just like he did with the people that he was with at the beginning? I say this, and I mean this. I say this as a fully committed, devoted follower of Jesus. I mean, I'm all in. Or like, I mean that. I'm all in as a follower of Jesus. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still things that I'm trying to understand. That does not mean that there are not still things that I'm trying to wrestle with. And that does not mean that even as I am reading through the Gospels and I'm trying to teach through them, that there aren't moments inside of the story that I've read 1,000 times before that I think, I never saw that, and I never thought about that, and I never really grabbed onto what was going on inside of that story. That's our goal inside of this series. I don't want you to be closed-minded. If you're not a follower of Jesus, I definitely don't want you to be closed-minded. I don't want you to shut it off and say, this Jesus thing, not for me. I want you to keep asking the questions. If you are a follower of Jesus, and you would say, I'm an all-in, devoted follower of Jesus, I've been following X number of years, X number of whatever it is, right? That doesn't mean that we can't keep asking sincere questions that lead us in a pursuit of Jesus. Because I think when we do that, we become better followers of Jesus. The best followers of Jesus that I've ever met, and I've met a lot of them. I've met some really good ones, and I've met some not so good ones. I've met some that I'm like, are you sure? The best followers of Jesus that I've ever met never feel like they have it figured out. They're more humble and more sincere and more devoted to pursuing Jesus than anybody else I've ever met in my life. And that is what makes a difference. That's why we're here. So don't ever lose that in the middle of all these stories, all these amazing, beautiful things that Jesus did. It's always for us to keep our eyes open. Keep seeing things that we've maybe never seen before. Keep seeing the beautiful things that Jesus does inside of people's lives and inside of people's stories that don't fit your theology, that don't fit your settled conclusion about Jesus. And sit there and live with that for a little while and wrestle with that. And let Jesus keep unsettling you, because that's the best way to follow him. I wish I could tell you there was another way. The best way to follow Jesus is unsettled. And I don't think, and maybe this is just me, I don't think you're going to settle anything this side of heaven. I mean, you'll settle some. I shouldn't say anything. I don't think you're going to settle everything. Just YouTube edit, get that. Make sure you correct that. I don't think you're going to settle everything that you want settled this side of heaven. But I think and believe that someday, your eyes are going to see what you have only imagined you could see. And then, I don't think any of your questions are going to matter. Would you pray with me this morning? Jesus, I'm grateful that we can come into this place and we can, as best as we possibly can, pursue a real, sincere, open-minded investigation of you. And I'm grateful that when we do, you show up in those places. You unsettle our settled conclusions. You mess with the things that we've always thought, and you bring us to a place where we see you more clearly, we understand you more fully, and we follow you better. And so, Jesus, I pray for each of us this morning, wherever we are, however we came in this morning, that we would allow you to do that in us. We wouldn't get thrown off too much by it, but we would allow you to do that so that we could be better as we try to follow you. We could represent what that means into this world in a better and more true way. We're grateful for it. We love you. And we pray it in your name. Amen.